So Dr. Adi Zoref-Lorenz is a physician and researcher currently in Mir Medical Center, Israel. She specializes in HLH, particularly alongside certain cancers, and has played a key role in HLH registry, aims to improve how physicians diagnose and treat all forms of HLH, which she'll speak on during her presentation.
Okay, hi everyone. First of all, thank you for the Histiocytosis Association for organizing this webinar. And I'm very excited today because I did many webinars, but this is the first one that is actually patient-oriented. And it's very exciting because my journey started with the patient, and that's why we're doing all these efforts. So today we're going to discuss HLH and cancer, and now we're trying to take research and transform it into patient care. So today we're going to try to understand HLH, what are the diagnostic challenges, and then we're going to delve into HLH in malignancies, the knowns and the unknowns of the diagnosis, the mechanism, the treatment, and then we're going to get to how you can help us join the fight, presenting the INTO-HLH registry, and we're going to finish with a discussion. So as I said, my journey started with a patient, a very special patient I treated exactly 7 years ago. And this patient had CLL, that is a hematologic malignancy, but this patient specifically, and the disease in general, was supposed to have a very good prognosis. And she was 72 years old. She was otherwise healthy. She did not need any treatment for her CLL until one day she came to us very, very sick with low blood pressure, low blood counts, big spleen, high fevers, kidney failure. She was very sick, and we excluded many diagnoses until eventually we diagnosed her with HLH, hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis, and I promise it's the last time I will say this full name. But the name was given after the typical picture we see in a bone marrow aspirate. When we take blood from the bone marrow to see how it functions, what we see is this picture. Macrophages, what you see is a big macrophage. It's a type of immune cells eating other blood cells. And this process is called hemophagocytosis. And this syndrome is a hyperinflammatory syndrome. It's not an autoimmune syndrome, which means the body does not attack itself. It attacks an invader that it should attack, like a virus or a cancer cells. But instead of creating a small campfire around this invader, it burns the entire forest, leading to end organ failure and sometimes, unfortunately, death. And when I treated this patient 7 years ago, what was out there in the literature was mostly focused on the familial form of the disease. The disease happening in children with genetic mutations, and that's what we followed. But I was very frustrated with the answers that I had to give to my patient and her family. And when this patient died, unfortunately, after a month and a half of us treating her, I decided to take this frustration and turn it into action and investigate HLH in the context of cancer. And I contacted the Michael Jordan of the HLH world, that is a panelist here. And I moved to Cincinnati to investigate HLH. So for you to understand what was then and how does it relate to the timeline of our developing understanding of what is HLH, I prepared this. Michael Jordan actually prepared this graph, and I'm using it. So HLH was first described in the 1930s, both in the context of the genetic disease in infants and also in the context of cancer. And by 1970s, it was well described. Many papers, case series describing this clinical phenomenon. And in the early 1980s, it was given its name, HLH. And in 1990s, the cousin, the HLH in the context of rheumatologic diseases, chronic rheumatologic diseases, was given its name. It's called macrophage activating syndrome, but it's a very similar phenomenon. And in the end of last century, the first gene was identified, perforin. And based on this discovery, Michael Jordan developed the first HLH model, and he discovered that the main factors driving this disease are T cells, a type of immune cell, and interferon gamma, which is an immune mediator, and we'll discuss this mechanism shortly. But only in 2015, there was a real focus on adult HLH with a big series from Boston, from Brigham and Women. And then there were reviews and all sorts of people wanting to understand and better treat HLH in malignancies. And with the introduction of immune activating cancer therapies in 2017, then this syndrome of hyperinflammation in hematologic malignancies became very frequent, and people have started investigating it in the context of these therapies. And what about treatments? So the first, historically, this disease was once 100% lethal sometimes, until experts from the Histiocyte Society identified an effective combination of two agents, steroids and etoposide, a type of chemotherapy. And then they started the first clinical trial, the HLH-94, and then this treatment was established as a standard of care of these patients. They were treated for 8 months, and then they had bone marrow transplantation. There was another trial that did not change a lot about this protocol. And based on Dr. Jordan's discovery, there was development in parallel of targeted therapy, anti-interferon gamma, and this therapy was FDA approved in 2018, imapalumab, for patients not in the front line, but patients not responding or with a recurrent HLH. So what is HLH? So as we said, it's a hyperinflammatory syndrome, but we recognize it by special constellation of symptoms and signs. And those symptoms are fever, big spleen, sometimes neurological symptoms, decreased blood counts, elevated inflammatory markers, things that we see in the lab. These are non-specific. Sometimes we see these patients present with end organ failure. But when we recognize this constellation of symptoms, we know and we identify that this is HLH, we know that this is a medical emergency that requires a prompt diagnosis, and sometimes we immediately need to initiate therapy. So what is the mechanism of HLH? So HLH involves the sophisticated part of our immune system, the adaptive immune system, that knows how to identify specific invaders, cancer, or in that this is the familial model. So a lot of time a virus like EBV, mononucleosis, and when a troop called dendritic cells identify this invader, it shows the invader to the most potent soldier, with the CD8 positive T cells. It activates, it tells them you need to start attack. And that CD8 T cells in those infants, wants to start to attack, but because he has a genetic defect, he cannot kill the target cells, which means that potent soldier is super activated. You have a troop of CD8 positive T cells trying to attack a virus. not succeeding to do that, but what they are succeeding to do is to secrete a lot of cytokines, to create cytokine storms, and cytokines are a mediator of the immune response. They know how to recruit other soldiers, other immune cells, and specifically, those CD8 positive T cells are secreting interferon gamma that is activating macrophages that instinctively eat blood cells, causing hemophagocytosis, and also invade the tissues to cause end organ damage and failure, and sometimes this leads to death. So this is the mechanism of familial HLH. And to identify the patients to enroll to those first clinical trial, a panel of experts developed an enrollment criteria. The patients had to have 5 out of 8 of these criteria you see on the screen, which are those that I described earlier that characterize HLH. But the problem is that with the increasing awareness of HLH and its popularity, we see it in many other contexts. And we call all patients that answer those diagnostic criteria patients having the HLH syndrome. And you can see here on the screen a lot of different triggers for developing the syndrome. So what you see on the upper right is familial HLH that we discussed. And this is a situation where there's clear hyperinflammation. But there are other situations like bacterial sepsis that can look exactly the same, create all those symptoms, but the immune response is sometimes adequate in this situation. So what we're interested when we look at a patient that presents all these symptoms is his immune system hyperactivated? Does he need immunosuppressions? If we'll give a patient with bacterial sepsis, etoposide, and dexamethasone, he's probably going to die from this systemic infection. So there's a big challenge in identify to determine, is my patient hyperinflamed? Will it gain from immunosuppressive therapy? That's the first real diagnostic challenge when dealing with these patients. The other main challenge is to identify the trigger. That we know that in a lot of these patients, if we want to identify what triggered the immune response, we cannot cure our patients. And you can see here on the screen many different triggers. So everything, all the pink circles you see are things associated with malignancy. So malignancy, patients with hematologic malignancy mostly can present HLH features, either a diagnosis, either on therapy, or with immune activating therapies. As we discussed, there's also the rheumatologic type, the MAS, and it can also be triggered by different drugs, and we call the syndrome TRESS. It's a lot of time presents with a lot of eosinophils. It's another type of the immune system in the blood. So all these different symptoms can cause the same clinical picture, and there's a need to identify the exact trigger. But the main trigger, the most common trigger for adults to develop HLH is hematologic malignancies. And we know that this symptom is very, has a lot of challenges, and it's important for us to delve deeper in why. And the question is why. So cancer-associated HLH is often triggered by lymphoma, but it can practically be triggered by any type of hematologic malignancies, MDS, leukemia, almost all hematologic malignancies. And it can also be the first sign of the malignancy. So sometimes you see a patient and you do not know that he has a hematologic malignancy, but we know we need to look for it in these patients. So we do an imaging, we do biopsies if we see enlarged lymph nodes, and sometimes it's very hard to identify the malignancy in these patients. Sometimes you even have to take out their spleens But this is super, super important to identify in these patients. And as we said, it can be triggered by immunotherapies. So all these immunotherapies, you've seen that mechanism that I showed. So the immunotherapies in cancer are the where cancer treatment is going these days. People are trying to find a way to activate the immune system against the cancer. But as you've seen in that diagram, when you overactivate the immune system against the cancer, what you get is exactly HLH with the hyperactivation of T cells and a lot of cytokines and macrophages. So almost all patients that are receiving these patients will develop some type of HLH, something in the spectrum of HLH or immune hyperactivation. And why is it important? It's important because some of these patients will not survive long term. So we need to identify them early and treat them better than we currently do. So what are the knowns and unknowns about diagnosis and treatment of malignancy-associated HLH? So first of all, how do we even diagnose HLH in patients with lymphoma? Let's say that lymphoma can create almost all of the features I described. It can create fevers and big spleen and decreased blood counts. So that's a real diagnostic challenge. The other question is how similar is the mechanism of cancer-associated HLH to what I've showed you that we know of familial HLH. And the biggest question and the most important one is how do we need to treat these patients? So in terms of diagnosis, so we have different diagnostic tools. The first and the most widely widely used is the one that I initially described, the HLH 2004, that again was designed as an enrollment criteria for patients with familial HLH. So it did not include patients with malignancy, and it's even specified within that criteria that in order to use it, you need to exclude malignancy. The other one is reactive. It's designed for reactive HLH. It is designed for adults. It's called the H score. And this tool takes into account several clinical and laboratory and histologic features. And you can calculate what's the probability of a patient to develop HLH. They have an online calculator. It's very handy. However, the cohort did not have a lot of patients with hematologic malignancies. And again, it was not focused on this population. And then there's the context-specific diagnostic criteria. So we have one for MAS, for patients with rheumatologic diseases, because we know patients with chronic inflammation, they have different laboratory values at the baseline. So they optimize the threshold, the diagnostic thresholds, and they're focusing on different diagnostic tests. And the last one is malignancy specific, and it's what we developed, and it's called the Optimized HLH Inflammatory Index, the OHI index. And what we did is we took all the laboratory values and clinical values associated with HLH, and we examined which of them has a good diagnostic value in identifying HLH at diagnosis. And if you look at the scary table, the main thing to look at is the column with the AUC. That's the best parameter to estimate if the test is a good test, is a helpful test, and if the value is above 0.8, it's a very good test. And we can see this value in both ferritin and soluble CD25, which are the inflammatory markers. And we know that ferritin is secreted from activated macrophages, and soluble CD25 is secreted from activated T cells. And we see that when we combine them, they have the synergistic effect. Their AUC is increased in diagnosing HLH. But what we also check is what's the power of all these markers to identify who is going to die to have early mortality, which again checked all the markers when we saw these two markers have the highest predictive power of mortality. So we combine them into the OHI index, and what you see on the right paragraph is that the OHI index identified more patients at risk than other diagnostic indices. And the thought is that if we'll identify these patients earlier, we can treat them and give them treatment, we can prevent them from going down the road of this hyperinflammation. And in a recent study, we also examined why these patients are dying, and we saw that while the ones that were negative OHI died mostly from lymphoma, the OHI positive patients died mostly from multi-organ dysfunction or single organ dysfunction or infections. So that indicates that probably it does identify real inflammation. So in terms of data out there of treatments, so that's a summary of the data as to 2022. And the upper part of the table is the standard etoposide treatment, and the lower part are novel agents. And what you see here is that across the board, the overall survival is not encouraging, but we do see some things that work better. Some things that work better, but these studies are not large enough. Most of them are not prospective clinical trials, so we have to get better data to understand what are the best treatments for these patients. So we're trying to do exactly that with the Histiocyte Society, the Adult HLH Working Group. We're gathering data from all over the world to try to understand, this is a very detailed data set, to try to understand what works the best for these patients, what improves their overall survival, their HLH response, their lymphoma response. And this process is still ongoing, but we're about to summarize it very soon. So if people want to join, you can contact me. And there are other critical knowledge gaps, like why do only some patients develop HLH in the context of cancer? Is there a genetic component in some patients? Is there something about their cancer that is unique? Some of these patients do not develop HLH at presentation, but they develop it on chemotherapy. So is it a similar mechanism? Is it a different mechanism? Should we treat it different or the same? And how can we identify harmful HLH in the context of immunotherapy? Because as I told you, almost all of the patients in which the patient works will develop some kind of hyperinflammation. But when do we need to worry about this hyperinflammation? When do we need to treat these patients? And these immunotherapies are becoming very frequent with new agents coming all the time. So we need to understand exactly how to identify hyperinflammation or maybe predict hyperinflammation. And the most intriguing question, to my opinion, is can we harness the immune response to better treat the cancer itself in these patients when we know there is immune activation? But the bottom line is that there is a very, very urgent need for more understanding in cancer-associated HLH. In HLH in general, and specifically in cancer-associated. And that is exactly why Dr. Michael Jordan years ago thought that this would be started to generate this project, a registry to gather data from different patients, for many patients, very detailed data in order to answer all these important questions. And with the support of Sobi, the company that developed imapalumab, we are able to create this registry. And what's unique about this registry, that it's actually empowered by patients. So most of the enrollment is made by patients itself. It's a registry that is only for patients in North America. And what is also unique about the registry is that there is a stellar team in Cincinnati Children's that collects the data and it abstracts the data there. So it's a very detailed and consistent abstraction, and we're hoping that this will help us understand more about this disease. So it's called the INTO-HLH registry, Insight into the Natural History and Treatment Outcomes of HLH. So it's a patient registry for the people. So again, there is a lot of needs in general to do a registry in HLH, to understand how it develops, how do we best measure response to therapies, how do we choose the best therapies in general, and how does HLH affect patients' quality of life. I can tell you that I see often, recently I've seen a lot of HLH patients, and I can tell you that it's so frustrating to be an HLH patient because there's so much uncertainty. There's a long process of identifying the trigger, and you treat the patient, but you don't know how long it will take the patient, and there is a lot of anxiety around the disease. So the study gathering data on quality of life is really important. And also, what are the short-term, but also the long-term complications of having HLH? So you all can, your loved one can participate. It's families of patients or deceased patients can enroll and contribute their data. So how to join the fight? So if you are not living in North America or you're not directly connected to a patient, what you can do to help is to spread the word about the registry, raise awareness about HLH in general. Those of you living in Israel, we have local efforts in Meir and Bellinson to prospectively focus on cancer-associated HLH together, data and samples, and we're going to start clinical trials as well. But if you are a past or current patient or family member of someone treated in North America, you can enroll online and join the registry, join the fight. So what does participation in the registry involve? So if you consent, you agree to give the team your medical records covering a period of 5 years around HLH diagnosis, for us to gather data on the symptoms, complications, treatments, and outcomes. And we also conduct surveys of quality of life for the patients. And of course, the information will be de-identified and protected in the most rigorous standards. And so how you enroll? You get into, enter the website hlhregistry.org, you click join the fight, and then you receive a unique link. There's a secure consent module, and you need to understand that it will take around 20 minutes. You need to prepare a social security number and some details around the diagnosis of HLH. And our team at Cincinnati Children's, we call the IHRT team, which is really incredible, can help you through this process and with any question that you might have. So we've reached the Q&A part. I think I'll do this slide first because I don't want to miss this part. I want to thank the Histiocytosis Association because doing this made me realize how hard they work to really connect patient, physician, and raise awareness to histiocytes diseases. Thank you specifically, Peter and Kevsky and Diana. Thank you so much. Cincinnati Children's for the facilitating everything, and so Now questions and answers.
So there's one in here and just states how rare is HLH, and they want to know if it's increasing or are we just becoming more aware of it?
This is a great question. So how rare is it? So there are different reports in the literature, ranging between around 1% and 3% in general. There are some lymphoma subtypes where it can go up to 20%, like histiocytes rich diffuse large B-cell lymphoma and angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma. So where it can, again, reach 20%. But this is HLH as it was historically defined by the definition made for pediatric population. So we are doing studies with utilizing the OHI index, and we can see that it happens, we can see it much more frequently in patients, and we think it's ranging between 5 to 25% of patients with hematologic malignancies that have hyperinflammation. And I can also say regarding the next, that's the second part of your question about is it increasing or is it awareness? I think it is awareness because I think most of these syndromes were summarized as a part of the lymphoma. Patients that are really sick, they have fevers and decreased blood counts that the physician did not understand and did not find any infection, and he would call it a steroid responsive disease, and now they have a name and they check the ferritin, they check the soluble CD25. So I think it's also awareness, and I'm getting bi-weekly calls of patients, mostly in Israel, and we're a small country. So I think it is much more frequent than people once thought or still think. Is a BMT cure for some cancer-related HLH similar to familial? Yes. So according to the literature, BMT is the treatment for hematologic malignancy-associated HLH that cannot otherwise be cured, or for refractory patients. And there's nice data from Dana-Farber about BMT, allogeneic BMT, that includes some patients in malignancy, but I think that there's a need for, again, more data to really say something very in confidence regarding this question.
And there's a question that was sent to me through the chat, just asking how patients can make their own physicians more aware of the OHI index if they suspect a family member might have a malignancy-related HLH.
It's a good question. Michael, Dr. Jordan, do you want to help with that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I understood the question. How could a patient or a family member make a physician more aware of HLH? Was that?
Or aware, like use it if he thinks.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, I'm a big advocate of being an advocate for your own healthcare or for your loved one's healthcare. I think despite the best intentions by physicians, sometimes they don't know, what you need unless you can speak up. And I think this is the sort of thing that if that is, something that occurs to you and it hasn't occurred to the physician, it is perfectly appropriate to speak right up to the physician. That may or may not be the case, but I think that, raising awareness with the physician directly is I think the best way. If this question is referring to in somebody's individual sort of situation, if the question is referring to kind of more generally for not an individual patient such as yourself or or a family member, then I think that working with advocacy organizations such as the HA is I think that really the most efficient way to go in terms of raising awareness. I mean, as Dr. Zoref-Lorenz probably already alluded to, we and others are trying to raise awareness within the physician community, but raising awareness within the patient community, I think really requires patient advocacy organizations. And in fact, it's actually a very good idea because these two groups actually, sort of synergize with each other. I think that patient awareness helps physician awareness in a very general sense as well.
Thank you, Dr. Jordan.
But by the way, hearing your question made me remember that my special patient had a very educated son, a very devoted son, that every morning we met him with a pile of the recent papers. And he challenged us with papers, and he made me go back at night and read all the literature. So next time he'll come, I'll make sure that I know everything that he prints. So I do think, and look, and he made me, go on a quest to get better answers. So I think there's true power for families wanting to improve their loved ones' care.
Mm-hmm. And if I could add one thing, I realized seeing the question in the chat now, I didn't see it a second ago. The question is also specifically talking about the OHI index. So the simple answer is like, how do you make physicians aware of the OHI index? And I think that's a really important issue and a very timely question because this is new. The paper came out in 2022, sort of defining it, and Dr. Zoref-Lorenz is the first author. So if you Google Zoref-Lorenz and OHI, I bet it'll take you right to the paper. I haven't done this, but I'm pretty confident it'll be on the first page of the answers. And I would actually hand the paper, or at least the abstract, if you can't get a hold of the whole paper, to the physician. That's a perfect example, and it's very similar to what you were just describing, Adi, with your experience of that family. That just hand them that paper and say, is this relevant? Is this potentially a better way to define what's going on here?
Okay, there's another question. Is the severity of malignancy-induced HLH the same or similar to familial HLH? So what we know is that both can present very acutely and severely with very elevated markers of inflammation and end organ failure. But we know that the prognosis of malignancy-induced HLH is significantly inferior to that of familial HLH, and part of at least part of it, I think, is a part of all those efforts invested for years, for 30 years in investigating familial HLH. Let's hope that in 25 years we'll get to better outcomes with malignancy-associated HLH as well.
Thank you. I have a great question from the chat. I think it may just be a simple yes or no answer. Maybe it depends, but Mark said, in these cases of malignancy, HLH triggered by cancer malignancies, HLH being called the cause of death in these cases?
Yes, so I showed the little data around that. So death from HLH is practically dying from multiple organ failure, and that's exactly what we observed in the OHI positive patients. But again, it's so I think most of them do die from that kind of acute syndrome. I will say that again, it's something that we need to investigate, but according to my clinical experience, these patients are not treated as well for their cancer because they miss some some cycles of their chemotherapy, so they're not getting the optimal therapy for their cancer that might also affect their
Right.
their outcomes.
And then speaking of treatments, Fernando asked, what are the provabilities of other treatments like CAR T1s? Is it possible to think about those for HLH patients?
That's a great question. So that's our fantasy, that we can use immunotherapies for these patients because we know their immune system is active, but CAR T cell therapy in a patient that already has HLH would be also very dangerous because you're at the risk of causing this heightened inflammation and organ failure. So there are other options like checkpoint blockade that might, there are things we are thinking about, but it needs we need data, but it's a great question. We need to see exactly that's why we need the registry, to see if these immunotherapies work better or are associated with higher mortality risk in these patients.
And thank you so much. These are the questions that we have here for anybody else that has questions. I'm going to have some emails in a second to send those to. And then here are the resources the Histiocytosis Association provides. We provide disease information, educational videos, grants, and other research initiatives, physician directory scholarships, awareness toolkits, which they're very useful right now as it is on the Awareness Month for histiocytosis. On peer-to-peer chats as well. To learn more, go to histio.org or to our Facebook and Instagram listed right there on the side. And there are emails if you want to reach out with more questions. And thank you both so very much for doing this with us. And I appreciate everybody for watching.